Good evening,
Good
everyone.
evening,
Thank you
everyone. Thank you
for
for
joining us this evening for the Development Review Procedure Manual Text Amendments Public Outreach Meeting. Um, the text amendment is a result of the text changes that have been going through recently, changes to the Land Development Code pertaining to application review procedure for amending the zoning atlas and rezonings. The DRPM section 6.0 will make references to updated application materials as well as review procedures. There are different subsections in section 6.2.1 that will be updated, including application requirements and narrative, project descriptions, as well as the land use and transportation information indicated on plan development site plans. This amendment will also accommodate recent submittal requirements, which have changed recently, as we all know, to the digital format. We're basically accepting PDFs and not anymore as commonly used in the past, the printed materials. So these DRPM changes also accommodate those submittal changes. Most of the changes also are reflected for the transportation information on plan developments, required on plan developments that the county has adopted recently in past code amendments, and application submittal forms are being also updated, and this is going concurrently with these DRPM changes. And if there's any question from the participants in a specific session that are being updated, feel free to ask us any questions. Or if transportation staff wants to add to some of those information being added to the DRPM, you're also free to jump in and mention those changes.
I'll also, for the record, this is Brian Grady with Development Services. I'll also add that, in building on what Israel provided, the intent of many of these updates is to provide more specificity and clarity for all those involved in the process as to what the expected documents and submittal requirements and information that's required for a complete application, so as to help facilitate, hopefully, more complete and sufficient applications from the beginning to avoid delays and information submittals later in the process that causes confusion and delays in the process. So a lot of the requirements, especially on transportation, there are a lot of transportation requirements which transportation can delve into, but a lot of those are information that's already being required now. It's just a lot of the information required that was in the DRPM was not out of date, and so it's being updated to reflect current practices and requirements and submittal requirements as directed by code amendments and also board policy changes. I would also note that we're amending the sufficiency review process. Where in the past, the sufficiency review process was just specifically dealing with the general site plan required to be submitted with plan developments, to expand it to include all aspects of the submittal requirements, and also to set up a process to provide a formal sufficiency review meeting with applicants to go over any deficiencies and offer a opportunity to make corrections within a specified time period in order to keep the project on track. And that's early in the process to get ahead of the review process to ensure that those comments are provided early, and also which ensures opportunities for revised information to be submitted in advance and earlier in the process for all those reviewing the record, including citizens and also staff, and hopefully provides for a more complete picture of the request and avoids confusion and delays and towards the end in the process, going through the hearing process. Thank you.
So, Brian, for transportation, since a lot of this amendment is about, or these amendments are about transportation, I'll just briefly go through them. And I think you hit on something that's really important. You know, a lot of this is just cleanup. things have changed, whether it's concurrency went away or the board wants things differently now, you know, different direction from the board, what have you. So this is really, frankly, intended to address mostly those sorts of things as opposed to really coming out with something new. So just kind of hit the highlights. You know, there's some cleanup language regarding study requirements that are no longer strictly necessary because we got rid of transportation concurrency, and I won't go through all of those. Some of this is to solve the difficulty that staff and the public and elected officials were having in reading differently formatted transportation analyses. And, you know, so we're trying to kind of streamline and make those consistently how we get them, make them consistent. And then just better communicating our expectations up front, because a lot of times right now, for example, you know, we'll start down the process. Something isn't necessarily submitted that we're going to ultimately need, and it ends up getting submitted at the last minute, and it becomes a problem. It causes continuances sometimes, and so this is, you know, we just are trying to better communicate our expectations so that everybody knows going in, so we don't have problems down the road, or we have less problems. There's a new cover sheet form that's going to help just facilitate turning things around, making sure that the information, we know what information is being submitted and what have you. And then, of course, the sufficiency review part of this and how administrative variances and design exceptions and certain parking requests fit into that, along with what the board wants now. And frankly, a lot of that we're doing already, again, because we've gotten different board direction than we used to have. But this is really to kind of codify it more in the DRPM. So that's just kind of some of the highlights without boring Mr. Weaver with too much detail. Ron, I'll also add, I don't know about Israel and their thoughts. We got some comments recently, as you know. We're still looking at those, and we haven't made any changes yet. We wanted to have this meeting, you know, before we start really looking at making changes. So just so you know that, Ron.
Anybody on staff and have any further add at this point?
Ron's got a meeting with a cast of thousands here. Looks like Ron's the only one in here that's external. How you doing, Ron?
Doing good. Thank you for calling on me. Let me speak in a minute if you want. Briefly.
Yeah, I think the floor's yours.
The floor is yours. I was just saying that operating theories have gone away.
Thank you. Thank you all. Thanks for letting us suggest a few things last week, and thanks for Mike for mentioning that y'all looking at. Could we turn to page 10 of 13, please? 10 of 18, please. Page 10 of 18 is entitled Specific Submittal Requirements. And the second set of boxes is second bullet is design exception request, i.e. deviations from technical standards in accordance with section 17.2. Aren't there a couple of WVR2 and or RP2, and I realize they're differently treated, and one of them is in challenge litigation, one of them isn't. One of them will be discussed in the morning at 10 a.m. at the county commission. But aren't there in RP2 and or WVR2 at least 2 or 3 examples of no design exceptions, please, from Mariella Smith and I think Pat Kemp and 1 or 2 others? Does anyone else remember that there were moments of truth during the RP2 and the WVR2 hearings where the county commission had said there'll be a few instances where we won't allow any design exception request in WVR2 and or RP2?
Yeah, so Ron, There was
a
section
section
added,
added, and
I believe it's the
I believe it's the
WVR.
WVR. Right.
which is, so it will take effect.
Right, and that one
Right.
it will sooner rather than later. And I obviously for RP2 the litigation will be whatever it's going to be.
Think about it, and we won't. As far as the WVR2, which is where I'll focus, is there some way you can put a footnote that says accept blank, comma, and then put whatever it is, which I think may have taken effect in the last few weeks or going to very soon, since not challenged, and therefore people don't go and try to deviate from it in that second line, and they can't. So they're sent a note saying, we ask you to give basis for deviation, but by the way, we don't allow in the following instance in WVR2 any deviation. I think maybe just a footnote as to where you please don't apply, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, or at least
At least
the reference to the LDC, to that particular LDC provision in WV, as opposed to the rest of the county.
county.
Right. Don't bother. And page 11 of 18. Let's see. I think it might be 18 of 18. Let me just make sure. Yeah, page 11 of 18, line number 2 again. Shall be required to meet, it's not the second set of boxes, it's the first set of boxes, and it's line number 2 under requirements. Shall be required to meet with development services staff. Could you clarify, Brian, as you did on our last industry call last Thursday at 3, the fact that that is not, or maybe it is, the no longer mandatory pre-app, also now called pre-submittal, or it's the mid-sufficiency, which candidly probably wouldn't work because you need to have this one, ironically, as a mandatory pre-app exception only for the charter and the private school. Because I assume you want this at the beginning, not in the middle. So she's a pre-submittal voluntary versus mandatory exception where she is mandatory for a private or a charter school. Unless I missed something.
You're muted, Brian.
You're muted, Brian.
Does that make sense, Israel or Brian, as far as?
Yeah, I mean, I can speak to part of it. I think, and again, with respect to charter schools and mandatory meetings, I think that's related to, I think, transportation and wanting them to get ahead of the requirements for those schools with respect to queuing and the queuing and whatnot. But generally how this is being redone is, yeah, the code was amended within the last year to remove the mandatory requirement to have a pre-submittal meeting in advance of filing of PD applications. The idea is that we would still offer more informal counseling if folks still desire to have that counseling, preferably through email communications, where we can certainly provide the same level of information, which is general in nature, through emails as opposed to having scheduled meetings. And again, through those email correspondence, we would get comments from Transportation and Planning Commission and Development Services staff, similar to what we did in the informal pre-submittal meetings. And so again, the intent is to try to do that informally, and obviously on a case-by-case basis, if there's a need to have a meeting, we can certainly schedule meetings, but it won't be a requirement. And the idea being that the formalized required scheduled sufficient review meeting shortly after filing deadline, again, would be a scheduled meeting where when an applicant files an application, they will be given a date and time to which they would attend. And, the staffs, especially Development Services, Transportation, and Planning Commission, would be in attendance to provide, comments regarding the application submittal with respect to the information required in the submittal documents, and that meeting would also occur after an agency comment deadline for other agencies that we transmit to. So again, if we have EPC comments, then we can certainly advise those. If there's comments that need some sort of revisions of the plan because of EPC, then you can respond to those also. So that's how the new process is intended to function. Again, we feel hopefully with this formalized sufficient review meeting at the beginning of the process, we'll get better feedback to the applicants regarding necessary information, and that information then will be get back to us sooner in the process to give all persons involved in the review and any interested citizens also more time to review those documents that'll be pertinent to the zoning review.
Thank you. On the schools, is 16 of
Hey,
18?
Ron,
Yes, sir.
I just wanted to say that there's a lot of feedback in this. I don't know why, but when we first started considering getting rid of the pre-app and creating the sufficiency review meeting, is that we were trying to use the pre-app to, y'all see me?
Yeah, we got you, Joe.
My screen just went off. Anyway, we were trying to use the pre-app to react to things that in many cases weren't being provided. And what I mean by that is that we didn't have, plans that were very complete. A lot of them were very rough sketches. So we wanted to get to the point where we could actually be reviewing something that was, at the level that we would be looking at for an application. So we decided to use the application process to, introduce a meeting at a point in time where we could be reactive to the materials that were provided and keep the application on track. And if there was something that was, incomplete, that we could also identify that and also identify a time frame that we wanted to get it from the applicant and enough time to keep things reviewing, with the goal being to get everybody to the hearing that correlates to the due date for the filing. And we were trying to keep, tweaking the pre-app, the required pre-app. We kept trying to tweak that to make that work. And so what we decided to do is to, instead of put all this effort and labor into something where we weren't getting very refined materials, not many materials at all, just more question than materials, that we decided to, put the labor into cases that already have some investment in them, so we could spend the vast majority of our labor there and still offer someone informal counseling on maybe a case that isn't fully baked, somebody just trying to get a read whether or not they should put it together or not. So that's kind of how we came up with, making the sufficiency mandatory and making the pre-app just an available service that someone can use as may be needed. And they don't have to necessarily provide us with any detail. They can ask questions, they can provide us a detail, but basically we'll react to the amount of detail that they provide. Whereas the sufficiency is a different type of, analysis. We've positioned ourselves in the applicant in sufficiency to hopefully, reap some benefit out of reviewing something that's been, refined and thought through to the point where we can keep things going and we can keep your client and ourselves on track to get to that hearing that, was originally applied for based on the due date. When we were working through the application and when we were working through the DRPM, there may be things in there like other meetings that we were thinking about that might be necessary to have, maybe before the application process. And I'm thinking this maybe where Mike may be coming from with the schools and the queuing on trying to get those things done out in front. So when it does hit the application review, there's something to actually work with, as opposed to sending you back to the drawing table after the case has been in there for a month. Because if you remember from some previous industry meetings, quite frankly, what's happened with the review process is that we ultimately get everything we need, but we're getting everything from applicants really the week before the report's due. And so if there's an aberration that we're dealing with, or there's a unique case that we're dealing with, that's one thing with one case. And, we're able to hopefully, accommodate that. But the problem is that when you multiply that by 15 or 16 cases, and the effect of it is that the filing week is when the application is becoming whole, it really puts all of us in a bind. It really puts, a lot of pressure on trying to get a continuance, and it just doesn't allow for a good creative thought process to go on when you're spread so thin, multiplying that times 15 or 16. So we thought by doing this, we would keep the cases more online in terms of, being, on time. And the other thing is that when the unique case does pop up that does require more time, then we're dealing with one case and not 15 or 16, you know, at the end of the review period. So that's kind of the backdrop of what this was done in. And anyway, I don't know if that was helpful or not. That really didn't answer specifically your question, but I just wanted to give you the benefit of that backdrop to know why we've been trying to do this and why we got rid of the mandate for the pre-app and then redeployed that, you know, at the sufficiency level.
Good. I think that was excellent. And in fact, candidly, I had some of the same interest in what's page 19 of 18. There's 18 of 18 is the airport. Then there's an unnumbered page, except that it has a number 6.1 general procedures, and then it has a sub A pre-application, and then it fortunately has what you just talked about excellently. And quite frankly, I think just maybe 3 words are missing in the description, which you gave perfectly, by the way, but which if these words could confirm the fact that the informal word in line 3 of what is 6.1 cap A on what is an unnumbered page, but it's the page after 18 of 18, which is the airport, that you might want to change the informal to say something to the effect that this is voluntary parentheses, not mandatory. That may be redundant, but it might be appropriate. And then counseling by, and then say which staff as to which 2 or 3 people from which departments be there, rather than memories or histories of it being 6 or 5 or 8 or whatever we vibrated the last 25 years. So you, in effect, would be sure it's voluntary, saying it at least more clearly than the word informal, and may request. And by the way, you might have to request it even if it's mandatory, if you know what I mean. And I think you described it perfectly in what you said. So maybe you just make sure that for the uninitiated, which I admit I'm not, but the uninitiated, especially the newbie lawyers and the folks that are insisting on doing it themselves, God bless them, is that they realize they don't have to do it, number one. Number two, if they do it, they'll only get staff from A and Z, not A and B and C and D and E. Maybe you might even say where we'll have it, which is real easy in our old rooms on that floor, you know, on our pool tables from waiting room. But anyway, that's just a thought. At that point, and maybe when you're through with those words, with those 3 or 4 added, you could put the exact same words on the very first page in the very second and third line, which is now also just a little bit vague. And first time or 3 I read it, I thought to myself, is that really what an uninitiated person would understand? Is if you would like staff to conduct a review of your proposal prior to the submission of your formal application, please complete and submit a request for pre-submittal review. Well, we know what that means, and you just described it perfectly, Joe. But you might want to say the same words that I just went through with those 3 additions, so that you've got it down that it's voluntary, not mandatory. You'll only get staff A and E, not A, B, C, D, and E, for that voluntary before, and the big deal's in the middle at the cost sufficiency. And maybe just say that then, meaning if you're curious whether you should do it or not, whether everybody else is doing it and you're not, and whether you really mean it to be voluntary, it's the big deal's in the middle. I don't know how we say that in legalese or in planningese, but we need to put planningese, the big deal's in the middle, cost sufficiency.
Right. Great comment, Sean.
I don't think I have anything else. I'm keeping you from your families and supper, probably. It's 6:30 and I should move to adjourn.
That sounds like a good one to me. You know, I want to be in the county April 30th, and I was hoping that we could get this all finished by then so it could be part of my legacy project. But anyway.
Don't bust a gut. It has to be done after. Don't bust a gut.
All righty, everybody.
All right.
Have a good evening.